We continue our discussion by talking about the pros and cons of international trade. And here we'll discuss free trade as a special form of it. And as you would remember from our past lecture, free trade refers to a international trade regime in which the restrictions between countries have been lifted or minimized. So in this system, which we can call free trade or unmanaged trade, there are some benefits as well as some challenges to the system. The first benefit of free trade is that exports bring other nations' money into the U.S. economy every time a U.S. company exports a product overseas. So speaking purely in monetary terms, this would mean that the U.S. economy becomes richer in monetary terms by the amount of the profits that the exporter makes, and the other country that buys the U.S. products would be poorer, again, purely on monetary terms, by the same amount. So imagine that a pair of jeans sells for $50 worth of euros in a European Union country, like let's say Germany, and let's say Levi's company spends $30 to manufacture that product, including all of the production costs. This means that they make $20 worth of profits out of this. That's the additional value added from these companies and all involved people's initiative to sell this product outside the U.S. Those $20 worth of European Union money, euro, is the U.S. economy's, it makes the U.S. economy richer and the German economy poorer, purely on monetary terms. A second benefit is that imports would simply mean more choices. When we go to an ordinary retail store or a grocery store or what have you, we would see many products before us on the shelves. And the reason for that is that we have a free trade system where the products of foreign countries are also sold alongside US-made products. And this competition is believed to create positive outcomes for us, the consumers, which means higher quality and service for the products and also lower prices. Another advantage of free trade is that imports would also create competition. This is actually the last point I made in the last slide. So when we think about the U.S. automotive manufacturing sector, we see that this is a very observable dynamic. In the 1960s, when the first batch of import cars were brought into the U.S. from Japan at the time, which, by the way, the picture here you're seeing is the very first foreign car that were brought to the U.S. It was a Japanese car, and it stimulated competition, and as a result, a few decades later, U.S. manufacturers realized that they have to produce more gas-efficient cars to be able to compete with Japanese-made cars like Toyota or Honda. And now, in our day, other brands like Kia or Hyundai from Korea are also challenging the U.S. manufacturers like Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and what have you. So this competition is positive, and the U.S. companies went on to make cars that are lighter, that have a better engine technology and requires less gas consumption as a result. Another advantage of free trade is that it reduces crony capitalism, because remember, if a trade regime is not free, this means that there are certain favors distributed by the government to certain companies in the country. We call that protectionism, if you would remember from the last lecture. And so which companies will get those subsidies to be supported against foreign competition, and which companies would get tax breaks or other protections like tariffs and quotas and etc. Becomes a huge question mark. And what we see in practice is that it paves the way for crony capitalism, which is the companies that are whose owners and executives are in close personal contact with the political leadership ends up getting these types of benefits from the federal government, but those benefits may not be the most economically justifiable ones. This problem is called crony capitalism, and if we have a free trade regime, then the need for crony capitalism would be reduced. Now let's start discussing the drawbacks of free trade. First and foremost, it jeopardizes domestic production by stimulating competition. So as we discussed in the earlier slides, car manufacturing in the US is also a good example of this dynamic, where a number of old US-made car manufacturers in Detroit went on to bankruptcy in the recent years, as you would know. Largely as a result of their inability to compete with foreign producers. So this is the number one challenge attached to free trade. And as a result of those business closures, unemployment rises. It's quite a well-observed phenomenon that every time a country opens its economy to free trade, then huge, large-scale job losses follow due to bankrupt or outsourcing companies. Outsourcing is a term that refers to a local domestic company closing its shop or part of its operations in the United States, and moving it to a foreign country where they can do the same job for a lower cost. So outsourcing. And the data shows us, this graph here is very telling in that respect. It shows us that every time the Chinese imports to the United States increase, or starting from 1990s, it's been on a steady inclination. And in the same time period as when this manufacturing trade increased with China, we see that manufacturing employment inside the US have declined almost on a symmetrical fashion. Another issue with free trade is that it also increases burden on public finance because when large numbers of people go unemployed, then the government needs to spend a lot of additional money for various purposes to those groups of people, medical benefits, income help, social security, disability payments, unemployment payments, etc. So this graph, again, between year 1990 and 2007, shows that how much additional money in percentage terms the U.S. government had to spend to those workers inside the U.S. who lost their jobs due to the product that they were previously manufacturing are now being imported from China. This is, again, a very instructive graph. Please take a moment to think about this. Another drawback of free trade is that it creates loss of tax revenues when tariff form of restrictions are reduced. So again, remember, free trade refers to restriction of trade barriers, and there are 5 main types of trade barriers. Tariffs are the main one. So when we create a free trade regime by restricting or eliminating altogether tariffs, then this means that our federal government's tax revenues would also decline, because tariffs are another term for import taxes. And then you have the environmental degradation as another challenge with free trade. I actually see this as a consumer every day in a very concerned fashion. When I go to a grocery store, let's say H-E-B store, and look at the produce, for example, what I find often is that many of the fruits and vegetables sold in U.S. grocery stores are actually coming into the U.S. from some foreign country, mostly from Latin America. And this is quite problematic in terms of our carbon footprint. So for me to consume that fruit or vegetable, so much travel has to be done, and these products have come from such far distances, thousands of miles away, instead of just maybe a few hundred max inside the U.S., which pollutes the environment quite a bit. If you think about how much products travel in our day back and forth between countries, even the simplest products on large ships, cargo ships, and all that, and large 18-wheelers that we see in interstate highways and all, then you get a scope of this challenge. Another issue with free trade is that it also creates an incentive for underdeveloped countries' governments to not improve bad labor laws that they might have. So what happens here is that let's imagine that you have a less developed country and their government has accordingly not developed their labor laws to be as protective and good as those that you might find in the US or other developed countries. Which becomes part of the appeal for a foreign company, large multinational company called MNCs, to invest in that country. So one large company spends a lot of money to start a factory of some sort in that country, partly because that country has lax labor laws. So to some observers, this is exploitation. To some others, they are not breaking the law, and this is just taking advantage of some business opportunities. But one thing is for sure, in seeing these conditions in real life is quite different than just arguing verbally. So that's why in the next slide, I'm going to share with you a documentary, and a couple of University of Oregon students went to, I believe, Bangladesh, if I remember correctly, to visit a Nike factory there to get a sense of what kind of living conditions local workers in those countries live as a result of their Nike employment. So in other words, how much is Nike really paying to these people to hire them? Is there any kind of exploitation going on in those areas as well? It's Indonesia apparently, not Bangladesh. My apologies. And in this video, please make sure to check this video. This must be one of the most eye-opening videos most students say they watched. I repeatedly get even some students actually breaking in tears when they see this documentary. I show parts of it in my classes. And what these two students found in their examination, which is now produced to us as a documentary called Behind the Swoosh, is that there are horrible conditions for these factory workers, and this large company, multinational, billion-dollar company, Nike, is exploiting pretty badly these conditions in those countries. So a challenge with free trade is that free trade makes this possible, and it also creates a reason for the governments of these countries, say in Indonesia in this case, to not improve their labor laws to a more decent level so that they continue to attract money from large corporations like Nike. So this caricature is quite instructive as well. Another negative aspect of free trade is that it also is closely linked to economic imperialism, which is a developing country's company exploiting developing countries' markets in some way. And we will discuss it more in the next segment.